Have you noticed how it feels like the world is constantly on edge lately? Like we're just one headline away from something major? Well, in this explainer, we're diving into a deeply unsettling question. Why does the world currently feel closer to a massive global conflict than it has in decades? We aren't just looking at random isolated incidents today, we're actually watching a complex web of massive global systems simultaneously crack under pressure. So let's break down exactly how these political, economic, and environmental systems are interacting and why their collision is rapidly pushing us toward the brink.
So let's just put it out there. Is the world closer to a world war than it actually needs to be? When you look closely at the sources, the answer is a resounding yes. But to understand why, we have to look at these massive threat multipliers at play. We are witnessing an unprecedented collision of historical grievances and modern political failures. Economic anxieties are morphing into deep ideological divides, and long-simmering ethnic and religious tensions are being ignited by sudden resource shortages. Individually, any one of these tensions is dangerous, but together, they overlap and act as a massive accelerant, drastically increasing the risk of a new, devastating global conflict.
To figure out how we arrived at this tipping point, we really have to start with the economy. Financial analyst Rana Foroohar points out in our sources that, quote, trade wars become real wars. And history paints a very clear, very scary picture of this. Think back to the 1930s, when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the U.S. triggered massive retaliatory tariffs globally. That economic nationalism deepened the Great Depression and isolated nations, essentially destroying their diplomatic safety nets. Because when countries stop trading and start building economic walls, they stop talking. And when they stop talking, physical conflict becomes the dangerous, almost inevitable next step.
So to unpack this complex web, our explainer today is going to follow a clear structure. First, we'll look at the economic engine driving these tensions. Second, the climate catalyst. Third, scarcity and extremism. Fourth, the security breakdown. And finally, we'll ask, can we avert war?
Section 1. The economic engine. From integration to isolation. Our sources indicate that the post-Cold War era of global integration is rapidly fracturing right before our eyes.
For decades, the dominant model was neoliberal globalization. The big idea was that free, unrestricted trade would lift all boats, entangle our economies, and basically guarantee peace because war would just be too expensive. But today, we're witnessing a massive shift. As wealth inequality has widened, working populations have completely lost faith in these global systems, and this has sparked a massive rising tide of protectionism and populism. We're seeing a surge in America First-style policies that view global trade not as a partnership but as a zero-sum game. And when a major superpower prioritizes isolation over cooperation, it triggers a rapid domino effect of protectionism all over the globe.
This ideological shift toward isolationism is heavily compounded by what analysts call fossil capitalism. Basically, our global economic system's intense reliance on fossil fuel extraction, particularly Middle Eastern oil, is historically and inextricably tied to military intervention. An enormous portion of our global military apparatus, including massive naval fleets, exists almost entirely just to secure and protect these vulnerable oil supply chains. This deep reliance fuels the global arms trade, ensures permanent militarism, and creates a baseline of constant geopolitical friction between superpowers scrambling to secure energy. These economic drivers create a highly dangerous loop. It starts with an intense, cutthroat competition for global raw materials and untouched markets. This competition, fueled by an overaccumulation of capital at the very top, inevitably leads to retaliatory tariffs as nations try to protect their own industries. Those tariffs then disrupt daily life, causing deepening domestic inequality, which in turn sparks massive populist anger among the working class. It is a continuous cycle, right? Economic distress at home translates directly into aggressive, nationalistic posturing abroad, setting the perfect stage for major international conflicts.
Which brings us to Section 2, the climate catalyst, nature as a threat multiplier. Because adding literal fuel to this volatile economic fire is the rapidly accelerating climate crisis.
Just look at this image. A polar bear navigating carefully around a massive military submarine right in the middle of the melting Arctic. This scene perfectly captures the literal collision of ecological collapse and rising geopolitical militarism. As global temperatures rise and the ancient ice melts, entirely new, highly lucrative shipping routes and massive deposits of untouched natural resources are suddenly being exposed. This is instantly transforming what was once a desolate, delicate ecosystem into a heavily militarized zone of great power competition. Nations are just rushing in to claim dominance over a melting world.
In the human cost of this profound ecological shift, it is absolutely staggering.
The humanitarian reports in our sources highlight a devastating figure: 100 million. For the first time on record, over 100 million people have been displaced globally. This is an unprecedented wave of mass migration, driven largely by the intersecting forces of extreme, unlivable weather, ruined livelihoods, deep poverty, and the resulting violence. When millions of desperate people are forced to cross borders just to survive, it radically inflames border tensions, strains the resources of neighbor states, and frequently triggers militarized responses. But here's a really crucial point our sources point out: a severe, ongoing political failure in response to this exact crisis. As these unprecedented environmental disasters mount, populist politicians are overwhelmingly mishandling the situation. Instead of embracing the broad international cooperation that is absolutely vital to tackle a global climate crisis, they are retreating inward. They're turning to nationalism, border closings, and isolationist rhetoric. Because honestly, it's just much easier to appeal to short-term domestic fears than to build complex, long-term global solutions. This political mishandling guarantees that the climate crisis and the conflicts it breeds will only deepen.
Let's move to our third section: scarcity and extremism, the fight for survival. Let's examine exactly how climate-induced scarcity acts as a direct catalyst for deep ethnic, religious, and ideological violence.
All across the globe, ecological collapse is actively breeding radicalization and violence. Consider Afghanistan, where consecutive years of severe droughts and completely ruined irrigation systems have essentially destroyed the agricultural economy. This directly fuels brutal warlord conflicts simply for the control of basic drinking water. Or look at Nigeria, where wildly unpredictable rains and desertification have completely altered historical migration patterns, igniting violent ethnic clashes between nomadic Fulani herdsmen and local farmers competing for shrinking plots of land. And in Iraq, extreme agricultural failures created a highly desperate, impoverished population, providing incredibly fertile ground for the rapid recruitment and radicalization efforts of extremist religious terror groups like ISIS. When the environment breaks down, the economy breaks down, and extreme ideological violence immediately steps in to fill that void.
This brings us to Section 4, the security breakdown. All of these cascading economic, environmental, and ethnic crises are culminating in a severe breakdown of global security, diplomacy, and most critically, the international treaties that were designed to keep us safe.
Our sources note a massive, terrifyingly rapid global arms race underway. The United States is currently spending upwards of $800 billion annually on defense, while China follows with roughly $300 billion. These are astronomical figures that signal deep, entrenched inter-imperialist tensions. To put that into perspective, the financial resources being poured into manufacturing weapons and preparing for conflict vastly outweigh global investments in climate resilience, green energy transition, or diplomatic peacebuilding. Nations are literally arming themselves to the teeth rather than investing in the actual solutions that could prevent conflict in the first place.
And you can see the rapid breakdown of treaties and diplomatic norms by looking closely at the Arctic. In the 1990s and through the 2008 Illicit Declaration, this region was a protected, celebrated zone of peace, tightly governed by international treaties. But the geopolitical shifts of the last decade, particularly the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, completely shattered that trust. By 2019, the U.S. was aggressively denouncing Chinese and Russian expansion in the region. The treaties and collaborative councils that maintained peace for decades are now actively fracturing under the immense weight of aggressive national interests.
And honestly, the Arctic is merely one example of this global fracturing. From the devastating proxy war in Ukraine, which has completely redrawn security alliances in Europe, to the highly contested waters of the South China Sea, where competing claims over vital trade routes threaten to spark a massive naval conflict. Down to Libya, where foreign interventions and resource wars over oil reserves have created chronic instability. The world is heavily dotted with these intense flashpoints. And in every single one of these regions, the multilateral agreements and treaties that once provided a framework for safety have completely dissolved into raw, unchecked power struggles.
Which leads us to our final section. Can we avert war, or are we repeating history? This synthesis of our sources brings us to a critical and frankly terrifying crossroads for the entire global order. Looking at this intense combination of fractured trade, surging economic nationalism, the rapid breakdown of peace treaties, and systemic resource collapse, analysts draw some chilling historical parallels. As Rana Forahor notes, the economic isolationism and political instability we're witnessing today look incredibly similar to the conditions that sparked the world wars in 1914 and the 1930s. Just like the 1930s, we are seeing the rise of hypernationalism, a global depression in diplomatic trust, and international institutions struggling to rein in aggressive powers. A widespread, devastating global conflict is not just a theoretical possibility anymore, it's a very real, logical outcome of these converging crises. So I want to leave you with this final vital question to consider. As the threat multipliers of climate-induced scarcity and economic nationalism continue to escalate, and as populist leaders actively dismantle the global treaties originally meant to keep the peace, are we doomed to repeat the catastrophic wars of our past? Or can we recognize these intersecting historical, political, and ideological threats, rebuild our diplomatic alliances, and course-correct before it's simply too late to turn back? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this deep dive has helped bring a highly complex global picture into much clearer focus.